Okay, Bojo Denwe Magana, Kwamet Mashike Manise Indigenous, Green Bay, Dochbaya, Chona Kendison and Dodem, Nishnabé and Dao, Bodwadme and Dao, Shishi Bani and Devin Douglas. Hello, all my relatives. As Carolyn said, I'm Mike Dockry, member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and had the distinct pleasure to work with the College of Menominee Nation and the Menominee tribe for the past, since 2005, and even before that. I'm from Green Bay, and Menominee tribe is there. So I want to share something that they've been working on here in terms of thinking about sustainability. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to give general, and this is after talking to Carolyn too, what might be helpful for all you. I'm going to give some insights that I've had for working with tribes for my entire career, just 3 of them, but it's things that are really important, I think, to help us when we're working with tribes or thinking about tribes and hearing things that might be different than we're used to hearing. Then I'll talk a little bit, just real briefly, about sustainability models in general, and then give some context for this Menominee model that I'll share. And then the bulk of the presentation, I'll dive into this Menominee sustainability model. And then we'll have time for questions at the end here. So without further ado, I want you all to put your thinking caps on here. And I want to ask you all a question. So maybe take out a pen and a piece of paper if you're there, or type it in on your phone. We'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but I want to ask you what some of your personal values, or pick one personal values you have related to natural resources or the environment. What am I talking about? These could be a place, could be a species. You might like turtles, for example. Activity, cross-country skiing is one that I like. Could be family history related to camping or eating food. Could be a feature, rock or water. Could be something with spirituality or religion. Could be a natural resource investment that you're using. So just take a couple minutes or a minute here and write something down, a personal value that you have. All right, that's less than a minute, but it feels long. I don't know if you've seen Yellow Submarine, but they do a minute and it takes a long time. All right, so we'll come back to this. I'll also challenge you to sort of think about your own institutional values. So wherever you're working, what are some of those core values that you have there related to natural resources and the environment? Okay, but I said I would talk about perspectives on working with tribes, and I've got 3 of them. These are always helpful to keep in mind when we're talking about tribal, working with tribes, Indigenous people. That one, our tribes are extremely diverse. That's really important to recognize. There's no one tribal voice. We are even diverse within our tribes. So there's no one Indigenous voice, there's no one Indigenous model of sustainability. There are many different knowledges, different understandings, different histories, different languages, cultures, etc. So working with one community could be extremely different than working with another community. And respecting tribal sovereignty and autonomy is really important as a part of this, that tribes are diverse. So we can't lump people together. Okay, another one, perspective on working with tribes is that tribes are resilient and forward thinking. That this is cultural for many, many tribes in the United States. And I like to show this map. This is a map that is looking at climate projections for 2095 in the Great Lakes region. And it's kind of looking at the summer and moving the states to what summers might look like in 2095 according to these climate projections. And what we see is pretty stark. And I always, when I'm in person, I say, who's been in Oklahoma in the summer? And it's really different from here. It's really different from Wisconsin, where I'm from. But that's essentially what we're looking at in these climate projections for 2095. And that's hard to imagine, right? That's hard to imagine. But tribes, we are resilient and forward thinking. And this is something that Robin Kimmerer, I don't know if you've read Braiding Sweetgrass, but she helped me think through some of this, and I've seen her talk about this too. So I like to put this out here. But when we look at my tribe, the Citizen Potawatomi, we were removed. So these are homelands. This, you can see Illinois and Indiana, kind of removed from this Indiana, southern Michigan, all the way to Kansas in 1838. And then in the early 1860s, we separated and moved. My ancestors moved down to Oklahoma. That's exactly what we see in those climate projections. We went through this massive climate, social, cultural change over 100 years ago, and we're still here. We, as Indigenous peoples, we're in Potawatomi. This isn't the only story of this. And so we've been dealing with change constantly for many, many generations at this point. And again, we're still here. We are extremely resilient. So understanding and working with tribes in that mindset is really important. Yes, there are many outcomes that are less than positive. We like to, you hear in the universities say things like vulnerable populations. But I want to put forth, we are the most resilient populations that we have. And that learning from that resiliency is a key to moving forward with sustainability, in particular, and climate change as well. Okay, the third thing that I want to bring up is that this is very, again, you can't paint with a broad brush, but many, many Indigenous peoples believe that we are all related. You know, plants and animals are relatives, right? We have this connection of being relatives, trees, landforms, water. And this is something that on the surface, I believe it's pretty easy to think about. Mother Earth, right? That's an easy concept that just rolls off the tongue. But I challenge everyone to think what it really means to be a relative. So I always show this picture. You can see our kids at the top left. Those are our relatives, right? If we're real, those trees are our relatives. Those birch trees there, you see some winnowing basket for wild rice and a birch bark canoe being made. If we approach the world that these are our relatives, what kind of decisions will we be making that are different than if we just sort of cursory say Mother Earth? Again, I'll bring up Robin Kimmerer, and she challenges us to think about, yes, we can love Mother Earth, but how do we act differently if we realize that that Earth loves us? This is a relative, and it's a deep thing. And I find myself constantly thinking about what does this mean in my life and how I'm acting, try to treat trees, plants, animals, other humans as deep relatives, which we are, and we're all related and connected. So those are some, I guess, 3 points that I like to bring out to people as I talk about tribes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about Menominee forest management, because this gives us context for understanding this Menominee sustainability model. So what I'm going to show now is a map that the Menominee tribe has made of their ancestral territories. It's 14, 15, 20 million acres, something like that. Menominee are indigenous from Wisconsin. They do not, my tribe and Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, we're all relatives. We have a shared migration story coming from the eastern seaboard. Menominee do not have a migration story. Menominee have always been here in this region. They emerged from this region. And they fought over the years really, really hard to stay in their homeland. And this deep value to their homeland, this tie to place, you will see where it comes out in the sustainability model. But yeah, you can see up here, I'll just point out, this is, you probably recognize, but this is Lake Superior. Duluth would be like right off the map here. This is the Bay of Green Bay, Lake Winnebago, Lake Michigan here. When we look at an outline of political outline of Wisconsin, here's the Menominee Reservation. Keep that shape in your mind here. It's about 235,000 acres, and most of it's forested and dedicated to sustained yield forestry or sustainable forestry. when you ask Menominee people, like, what is sustainability to you? And this is another question you can ask yourself. What is sustainability? How do I define that? And I think it's worth digging in, even though we might think that we've talked about what sustainability is for so long that it has no more meaning. But I think it really does have a meaning. When you ask Menominee people, they say a lot of different things, but I'll just share one of the things they talk about when they say sustainability. They say, look at our forest. So here's a Google Earth image. You can see the tip of Lake Superior up here. Down here is, again, Green Bay. And right here in the center, you see this? That outline that I said? That's the Menominee Reservation. You can see that from space. I'll put the boundary lines on and you can really see it pop out. That's amazing. So what is sustainability? Many Menominee people will say, look at that Google Earth image. Look at those satellite images. That is sustainable. That is what we talk about when we mean sustainability. And what's amazing about this is that from 1854, when they signed the penultimate treaty, 1854 and 1856, until today, they've been cutting timber from that forest. This is one of the most intensely managed forests that we have in the Lake States, probably in the country. They've not harvested this forest once or twice, but probably 3, 4, 5, even 6 or 7 times. And they have more than when they started, and it's of higher quality. It is a testament to sustainable forest management, to Menominee values and Menominee sovereignty in managing their forests. So this is really amazing. So when they say, they point at that forest and they say, look at that satellite image, it really is amazing. And that is one of their definitions of sustainability. Okay, that's just a little context. There's lots of books and things and I've written some stuff about Menominee as well. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely look it up and find more about Menominee forest management. All right, now I'm going to talk about some sustainability models. I haven't done this talk for a while, so it's kind of exciting, or I put this kind of together. I used to talk about this quite a bit, maybe 15 years ago. And so I was kind of digging in, and you can see some of my old backgrounds for these slides. That's a nice sugar maple stand on the Menominee Reservation. But you start looking, what do you think about when you think about sustainability? Carolyn didn't mention, or I didn't put in my bio, I used to work for the U.S. Forest Service for about 20 years. And I did things like National Environmental Policy Act, environmental impact statements, wrote management plans. So really looking at what sustainability is from a federal standpoint. And this is a pretty typical model that we see. Right? We see this 3-legged stool. Okay. Society, economy, and ecology. And we say sustainability is where all those things are kind of coming together. Pretty sure all of you have seen this. That's pretty nice. It's really easy for us, I think, as scientists or as practitioners to look at the ecology part of sustainability. It's a little less easy, but still we can do it. We can look at the economy and start thinking about sustainability. But then we have this huge thing called society. And that really seems to be difficult for many people. What is that? It's so broad. I just talked about tribes. You know, we're all diverse. There's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Like, what does society mean in this context? It's really difficult to get to that social sustainability. Here's another model that's put out. It's kind of the same thing, but it's labeled a little different. You know, healthy communities, economic vitality, natural environment. It's another way. You can think about that as the triple bottom line. I know that you've heard of that, right? There's another model, like a strong sustainability. That's this one, where it's the same 3 things essentially, but they're embedded, and it says you can't have a strong economy without a strong society. You can't have a strong society without a strong environment, right? But those are still the same 3 things, and I think they're very difficult to grapple with in and of themselves. So back to the Menominee, the community really, well, let me say this. This model that I'm going to talk about, this Indigenous model from the Menominee, was created by the College of Menominee Nation. So in the 1990s, the College of Menominee Nation was formed, and they got together and they really wanted to understand and develop theoretical models for how they have been able to manage those forests sustainably since the 1850s, when forests all around have not been managed in the same manner, right? So they brought together academics, forest managers, community members, and had meetings and really talked about what are the factors that have allowed us to do this sustainable work. And they also wanted to make sure that the integration of Indigenous knowledge, in this case, Menominee knowledge, was embedded within the sustainability model. So what I'm going to share now is what comes out of this work at the College of Menominee Nation over in Wisconsin. And it's their sustainable development model. At the end, I think we'll share with you a paper that you can download. We wrote a paper on this, so you can read more information about it. And I think we'll share it in the email follow-up. But I'm going to walk through what this model is. So again, compare this in your mind with this three-legged stool. So Sustainable Development Institute model shows that there are 6 interactive and dynamic dimensions to sustainability. So not 3, but 6, okay? And they're interactive and dynamic. The first one is land and sovereignty. That is very specific for Indian country. This is our tribal sovereignty, that we are separate governments. This is our land. This is our homelands. These are very specific terms. When I think about it outside of the tribal context, land and sovereignty really means who's making decisions for the lands where you are. That's a key component of sustainability. Who's making decisions? Another component, this might look like the other like three-legged stool models, natural environment. But in this model, the Sustainable Development Institute, or the Menominee model, natural environment includes human beings. We are not separate, we are all related. I had that slide earlier, right? We're all connected. We're not separate from this. And I think one of the downsides of that three-legged stool is, yes, people are in economy, people are in society, but there's no people necessarily in that ecology. This is very different. Okay, next one. Institutions. Institutions are an important part of sustainability under this model. Institutions can be our modern tribal governments, our tribal colleges. They can also be traditional institutions like our clan systems. It's an organization for us as we in our society. So these are these institutions. That's an important part of sustainability. Another part is technology. So technology includes both modern GIS, or geographic information systems, modern forest management techniques, for example, and also traditional technology, like those birch bark winnowing baskets that you were seeing, or the birch bark canoe that was in the other slide. Those are also technologies. So technology is an important part of sustainability as well. Fifth dimension is economy. Yes, this is very similar, so that's important as well. I like to think of this one as, again, I'm explaining the dynamic nature of these things. Economy, we can think of household economy. You know, how are we living individually? How are we living as a community? Regional economies, national economies, and international economies. Again, that's an important part of sustainability. And finally, human perception, activity, and behavior. That is both, how do I see the world? Why do I recycle something? Why am I participating in a reuse economy, or why am I not? Why am I dumping my garbage at the end of the road? Why do I see that and think different things, right? Human perception, activity, and behavior. We can think of that individually. We can also think of that communally. Why is one county doing something and another county is doing something else with regard to recycling, for example? And so this model says sustainability is dependent upon these 6 interactive dimensions. I'm going to go further here and explain. So here we go. Sustainable development is really a process. So it's not an end goal. It is a process of identifying inherent tensions among these different elements and then balancing those tensions. So this model is nice because you can visually see them. So these intersections illustrate the tensions. And now watch closely, because this is my favorite thing in my presentation. It's a good one. As these tensions are relieved, this model says, new tensions can arise. Look at that, right? It's a process. It doesn't end. Yeah, I see some smiles. Thank you. And so the sustainability is defined as a process of identifying and relieving these tensions among these different elements. There's also internal tensions as well that can be identified. My colleague, Kyle White, also has some things. And so I think this is a very indigenous way to think about the world. He talks about sustainable development, or he talks about indigenous knowledge as a process. Other scholars talk about processes. Again, time is not linear. These things aren't linear. They come back. They're iterative. And sustainable development under this model is the same. Now, we still haven't really answered the question about how the Menominee have balanced these tensions. Right? So it's a process of recognizing and understanding these tensions and then trying to balance them, recognizing that old tensions might pop back up, new ones will arise. So for the Menominee, and this is where the value comes into play, right? Menominee have balanced these tensions because of Menominee autochthony. That's a big word. If you got that on Scrabble, you'd be doing pretty well, I think. Menominee autochthony. Autochthony means literally coming from place or rooted in place, growing from the land and the soil. In the paper, we talk a lot about it and how it's been used globally. It's not always seen in the best light, and some people have used it to exclude. But in this case, this is really Menominee's tied to place. They literally come from the land where they are. And that connection to land, I will say that connection to place, is what has helped Menominee balance these tensions as they arise. Right? That is a core value for Menominee. So they said, no, look back at what your value was. And you can think about through the rest of this presentation, what, how you could balance tensions in this model using your value. And at the end, I will prompt you to think about your institutional values as well, and how your institutional value can help you understand and balance these tensions. So why is this model cool? This model is, so your heads might be spinning a little bit like that graphic I showed, but really what's amazing about this model is that it can be used to construct a narrative. And this narrative can look at the different elements, it can look at the different tensions. You can use it to understand change over time. You can use it to talk through what is going on today in the present. You can use it to understand multiple perspectives, right? It can create a vision for the future. So planning, where do we want these elements to be in the future? So it's a really useful tool for planning. It can formulate solutions. How do we relieve these tensions? What can we do with this model to relieve these tensions? That will be solutions for us. And especially with that value in the middle, but also throughout the other elements, it's really good at incorporating indigenous knowledges and indigenous values. This is extremely important to think about, constructing a narrative. When we look at Al Gore's movie, for example, or we just published the National Climate Assessment a couple days ago. There's a lot of graphs and figures in there. It's hard to make sense of all of those in together. It's easier to look at, okay, ice is coming on earlier or later, it's coming off earlier. We have hotter summers, for example, we have more rainy springs, whatever the case may be. We can look at those graphs individually, but then to tie it back and understand, what does this mean for our land? What does this mean for our communities? It's really difficult. But if we construct a narrative, we can start seeing those connections rather than looking at 50 graphs and trying to understand what's going on. It really fosters creative problem solving. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how to use this to construct a narrative, and then I will give an example. It's a forestry example. I was trying to come up with a reuse example, but maybe I'll need your help for that one. But anyway, so these are some of the questions that you ask as you kind of walk through. So creating a narrative is nice to kind of just walk through. Land and sovereignty, we ask questions like, does the community have control over their resources? What about the past? Who's making the decisions? And then each one of these elements will ask, how does this affect other model elements? Natural environment. How has the natural environment changed over time? How do people interact with the natural environment? How did they interact with the environment in the past? What do we want in the future, right? And then how does this impact or affect other model elements like institutions or human activity behavior, land and sovereignty, etc. We'll go for institutions now. You know, how are community institutions organized? How have we been organized in the past? What might we need to do in the future? How have these changed over time? Why have they changed? And how do they affect the other model elements? Technology, same thing. You know, how is technology used to influence the different model elements, right? That's a good one. I kind of switched up the order here. You know, how does a community use technology? How has technology changed over time? You know, as we're fishing, you know, treaty rights is a big one in this region. So how have fishing technologies changed? How are we managing those resources? Economy, how does the local economy work? How is it tied to the global? How does the global influence the local? And again, how does that economy influence the other models? Finally, human perception, activity, and behavior. How do individual community members or peoples perceive forest management, for example, or how are they perceiving things? How does the community as a whole look at the world? How have these perceptions and behaviors changed over time? You know, why are we recycling now, or why are we not littering now as much as we used to back in the 70s, right? Why has that changed? And then how do these things affect the other model elements? And then finally, this idea of autochthony or sense of place. I like to ask, how does the community perceive their sense of place? How does this impact the other model elements? What are some other, and this is what I asked you to do, what are some other values that might influence decisions that we can think about to balance? And then what are your own values related to this? So now I'm just going to give an example, and I'm kind of starting to wrap up here. So this is the one, I'm going to do a forestry example, but I think you all could come up with your own institutional work that you have to do on a daily basis, could come up with some examples as well. I probably did too much graphics on this one. I like the other one, but this is too much. Okay, natural environment. This is, in the past, we've had a diversity of forests kind of across the landscape. We've had different species, different age classes. In this example, I'll talk about fire and wind influencing the forest. So a tornado comes through. After that, typically that forest will dry out. Our native, historically native communities would burn that area, and we would have a patch of younger forest growing up there, older forests that didn't get blown around. So you have different ages, different species. Two species that really like this fire and open light coming down in an open area are white pine and aspen. So I think most people know what a white pine tree is, and aspen, beautiful yellow leaves. They're probably blown down now at this point, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Those trees need light that comes from a disturbance or like a windstorm. White pine in particular need fire as well to get down, burn the duff layer so those seeds can regenerate. So this is the natural environment. This is today, foresters, I'm a forester, we harvest, we call it a regeneration harvest. Clear cutting is one form of that, but essentially we're mimicking as foresters this ecological system when we do these cuts. So that's us as humans imitating this ecological system. But okay, so I'm painting the picture here. Human perceptions. Let's think about this. there are some very positive perceptions about forest diversity out there. Big white pine tree. I think we all love that. Aspen, I already mentioned, turning yellow in the fall. Beautiful, okay? So there's perceptions about that, positive perceptions about diversity. There's positive perceptions about these species as well. But we also know that there's some real negative perceptions about clear cutting. So our management to maintain those species on the landscape, there are definitely a segment of people that have a very negative impression of that. Okay, so I'm starting to lay out, I'm building a narrative here. So there's a tension, right? And I'm using this model to illustrate that tension. So how could we relieve this tension? Well, we could change human perceptions. How do we do that? Okay, well, one of the things we might want to do to change that human perception is to change our institutions. Or think, in this case, let's think about grade school and how we learn about ecological systems in our region and making sure that students understand that white pine, in order to regenerate, needs open, light, and bare soil. Those are things that when we create as foresters is mimicking that. So we can change our institutions. Okay, that's one way to change perceptions. Another way might be to develop new technologies. New technologies in how we manage for white pine, for example, that don't have that same negative perception. So whether we leave groups of trees, different view sheds, different ways of processing that wood as we move through, different ways of approaching our forestry. In the past, we've done these square sort of harvest blocks. Those are ugly. Those go into this negative perception on what this is. So changing the technology could be a way to relieve that tension. So that's a very simple narrative of this model. I'm a little bit ahead of schedule, but that's okay because I want to have time for discussion. This is what I want you to think about right now. And then I have a summary slide too. But what is your value that you wrote down in the beginning? I'll say even feel free to share it in the chat if you want. How could your value be used in this example that I gave about this tension between perceptions on timber harvesting? How would that be part of that? What other dimensions could relieve this tension in the story I just told? You know, maybe it's decision making, maybe it's the economy, something else. And then what are your organizational values? And most importantly, how do you think you could use this in your work? It's hard, it might be a little bit hard on Zoom for this, but when I give this presentation in a group that is in person, we have a lot of discussions afterwards. And there are heated discussions and there are excited discussions. And it's kind of funny because when I talk about NEPA and environmental impact statements, I don't really get that same, and how to do that, the process of doing that. I don't really get excited discussions because, again, I think it's hard to break down that three-legged stool in a meaningful way. So just to summarize, this model is based on the Menominee experience. It's really flexible and can be used to understand the past, understand present situations, and develop future solutions. All sorts of kind of people can use this. Researchers, I can use it to frame my research. Planners, when I was doing planning, we can use it to frame planning activities. Communities can use it to understand sort of what they're doing. It's very dynamic, as you see. It can incorporate scale, time, and complexity. And it can incorporate Indigenous knowledge, especially as a balancing factor within these elements. So now you're going to say, this is my slide for questions. Discussion and questions. What the heck is that? That's our daughter doing some roller skating on a giant skate ramp, which is our cue to talk now. Like, why are we showing that? So thank you, Miigwech.
All right, we'll open if anybody wants to share what they had wrote down earlier, or learnings or takeaway items, and then we can also do questions too.
I jinxed myself by saying that excited discussions here.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, great. Oh, that was an excellent presentation. And so I can share with my thoughts, I guess. Well, and you asked for what my connection was. So I love the backpack. It's a big proponent, and I spent I did a really long trip recently, and I think language is so important in this, and I've struggled with this a little bit. But like when you say backpacking, you think like, oh, they're really environmentally focused, and I think doing all the kind of the right things. Well, the experience is also like we eat a lot of crappy food that's in plastic containers, and like really not a sustainable process. Or actually far from it. And it's not so much to bash backpacking, but more so about like how to move past that initial language barrier, right? Because if you say the word forestry to some people, they immediately think cognitively of tearing down forests in an unsustainable manner. And I don't know, if you have any advice on how to work past that initial hurdle with that language? Because I've had conversations with people, and however your passions are, but like I firmly believe we wouldn't have ducks without duck hunters. But if I say that to some people in some crowds, like they don't want to talk anymore, and they're already over like, oh my gosh, I could never advocate killing birds. Well, I appreciate that, but there's data and support there. And so same thing with forestry. I think lots of people who work in the lumber industry are passionate about trees, love trees more than I ever could. But they think historically about the bad things that have happened with that. And I was wondering if you had any advice or encouragement on how to move past that initial language barrier.
Yeah, one of the things we've used this model for is to have those discussions. So having different people develop their own narratives and then sharing those narratives. So the duck hunter, for example, could share, yes, part of their activity and behavior is hunting ducks, but another thing is that their activity and behavior could be, or the Ducks Unlimited, for example, an institution, what is that doing? It's actually putting a lot of money towards wetland conservation. Right. And so once we start building those narratives, and maybe somebody will have another narrative that says, I believe animals shouldn't be killed, and they can kind of spin that out too, and we can have a discussion. And what you will find is exactly what you were pointing at. I think that there's an equal love for wetlands. There's an equal love for those species. We're just acting and behaving a little bit differently. And we start building that strong relationship amongst ourselves that we can see each other and value each other as other human beings a little bit more. And so we're not, and because we have a narrative together, we're dialoguing, we're strengthening our own relationships. So that's one of the things I've seen. Here's an example that I've used a model for when I was first learning about this. There was a rural school district in Wisconsin that was gonna merge, like two rural school districts were gonna merge. And and students were gonna have to ride the bus for like an hour to get to school. And I really started thinking, okay, let's look at this model, and I'll just focus in on that sense of place in the middle. But if we really believe sense of place or tie to the land is part of sustainability, what does that mean if we're, moving people an hour away from where they actually live? That seems to me to be a negative, or something that could bring us to a less sustainable situation than if they stayed and learned in their own place. Yeah, hopefully that helps you there. Let's see, I'm looking at some of these comments here. Anyone else want to unmute and ask a question? Carmen.
I think there's a lot of shaming involved with sustainability. For example, I would love to compost, but I hate the smell and the bugs and going outside. And then if I say that, I get shamed for not doing it. But there are other ways that I could do it, like a machine inside the house that uses electricity. So in those contexts that I love you know, going for walks in the woods. So I don't want any management. I don't want any clear cut. I don't want any burning. And that's create shaming of people. And that's something that we as a society need to work on. That we should learn not to shame people of what their activities are in relation to the environment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think that if we dig in a little bit more and look at, again, this model holistically, you'll have a broader picture of, like you mentioned, you know, certain things have energy. We can start thinking about life cycles and like the broader picture. It's not just, do you compost or not? Like that's a pretty simplistic, you know, example that you're right. And people might look down on non-composters or whatever, but there might be reasons for that. And understanding of the whole system, I think this model helps us do that quite a bit. Yeah, thanks for that comment. And also, again, if we build narratives together, we can build collective narratives, and we can also build individual narratives, and those will help build our relationships. Back to that Indigenous value of we are all related. We need to foster these relationships because that is part of sustainability. I'll say another thing about sustainability here too. Oftentimes when we talk about sustainability in a tribal context, things like language come up. What is, and you mentioned language with the backpacking. This is, I'm talking about Indigenous languages. Like that's part of our cultures. And that is part and parcel with sustainability. It's the same thing as reducing greenhouse gases. That's hard to understand. But when we look at this holistically, that's really important. And again, the three-legged stool does not help us with languages. It's really easy. I'm at University of Minnesota. It's really easy to say, what is sustainability? Sustainability is energy, heating, cooling, energy, transportation. And we can work on that. We can get solar, we can get efficient windows, etc. But that's not the entirety of sustainability. Even under the three-legged stool, we know that's only one piece. And we really struggle, I think, to bring that human component into it. If you noticed, every one of those elements in the model, human beings are involved. We are part of this. So our languages, our cultures, our understandings of the world that inform how we perceive and behave, those are extremely important components of sustainability. And we will never be sustainable if we don't have that as part of what we are doing. I see some questions. Maybe I'll read one from the chat about forest industry in the Midwest, mimicking natural disasters and sustainable harvest practices. I think we do a pretty good job in the Midwest with our forest management. We have a lot of laws and regulations that we follow, particularly the public lands, right? Industry also has laws and regulations. A lot of our industry has certified forestry operations. That's the, I don't know if you know the like FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, certify sustainability. So just like what do you call it, like shade grown coffee or organics, it's a label for sustainable forestry. Much of our industry in the Midwest is certified. So it's a third party market-based solution to unsustainable harvesting, and it lays out criteria. So I think we're doing a pretty good job. I think we also need to do even more, not necessarily more intensive harvesting, but again, you see Menominee, they're harvesting constantly, and it looks like it's an old growth forest, right? They're doing something a little bit different in terms of their management. I think we can emulate that, but they're also certified. So I think we do a pretty good job in the Midwest. Can we do better? Yes. Especially on that social side, how are we looking at these harvests? But I truly believe wood is part of our solution to climate change. Wood can be used for pretty much everything we use petroleum for. And wood is renewable. We can harvest trees and we can grow them back. Wood is beautiful. So socially, having wood floors is unbelievable. Plastic floors versus wood floors. What do you want? Right? Beautiful stuff. We need wood. It's sustainable. We need to foster, I think, our sustainable, renewable materials. So versus concrete, for example. Minneapolis has a wood skyscraper. I forget what the building's called. Does anyone know? Anyway, it's cool. We're starting to use wood in different contexts here too. That's important for us. It's really important. So I think we're doing a pretty good job. We could do better. Of course, we can always do better. Again, that model says there's tensions. They never, you know, they might go away now, they might come back, but we're never there. We're never totally sustainable. We have to keep working on that process. Let's see. Does anyone else want to unmute and ask a question?
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's extremely helpful for me. I've been doing what's called guerrilla gardening for bumblebee restoration, and have come into really weird feedback from like municipalities that have told me I actually have to stop volunteering because I won't use glyphosate to kill invasive species. And buckthorn is a pretty big example of one where I've been working in areas where an endangered bumblebee is at, and municipalities are coming in and killing all of the buckthorn using glyphosate. And I've been kind of alongside of them, knowing that they're going to come in and use herbicides and insecticides that kill everything. I've been coming in behind them and kind of triaging this bumblebee population by planting mature plants and uprooting the buckthorn from the whole root, and then putting in a mature plant in its place that will provide pollen and nectar urgently. And I've come into some very weird sort of arguments that I'm wanted feedback on, just in terms of like, if you encounter these conversations, how you approach them. They seem to be deeply linked to actually like our legal processes, and like how glyphosate is a good example of a chemical that has been repeatedly shown to cause cancer and cause harm. And then they adjust the chemical makeup ever so slightly to keep on using it. All the while, it kind of cues it up for like a whack-a-mole game of like, okay, now prove that our new chemical makeup won't cause cancer in drinking water. So it's an odd fight, and I'm coming to terms with the fact that we're running up against time clocks for like this endangered rusty patch bumblebee as a good example, where we have large swaths of land that are being turned over to death. Well, we need to be restoring faster, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
But
I think, you know, you pointed at the institutional nature of this, and also the tension with natural environment. So like you can use this model, kind of work around. Clearly we need solutions that can, like you're saying, treat larger areas and support more life. I know a lot of tribes are trying to get away from herbicide use in both forestry applications as well as invasive species control. Sometimes, you know, that you have to look at what is the, you know, they're balancing, so that municipalities balancing the time, effort, money with the natural environment. So I think having those discussions, there are new solutions coming in for buckthorn and other invasives, goats, for example. And I know many institutions are using goats. I think the counties even use goats sometimes. Some of the tribal foresters that I've worked with talk about an insatiable demand for goats. So there's actually probably a market for somebody for people to continue to raise goats, particularly for buckthorn removal. Fire, I think fire is something that I was mentioning to Carolyn before we started, is something that's been part of our ecosystems, that I don't know how it reacts with the bumblebee, but fire and many of our grassland species, our savannas, oak savannas, need that fire, and we have not had it for a while, so restoring fire. But we need to be talking about all of these issues in conjunction with each other. Yeah.
one
Thanks for that
follow-up
question.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up question?
A short one. if
Do
others
you-
have
oh,
questions.
Oh, go ahead then. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I don't know if others have questions, but just short. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do you know if any populations in Minnesota and Wisconsin that are part of tribes are open to working with like nonprofits that are looking to use fire, if they could actually be employed?
Yeah, 100%. Tribes are working with like the Nature Conservancy and other land conservation. The Nature Conservancy does a lot of fire and burning. Tribes are working with the federal and state governments that are doing also burning and forest management, et cetera, working with the university here. Yeah, tribes are, but it's important to have that respect that tribes are sovereign governments and approaching in that manner. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question. Any other? Yes, Renee, it looks like, or Renee. Yeah.
Yeah, my question relates to something you had said earlier, about the individual voices in the tribes. And my question is more directed to that, because one of the things that has been notably significant to me as someone who's not a member of the tribes is the fact that there's a voice of unison there. So can you talk a little bit about the common and shared voice versus the individual voice?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. One, especially if we're not members of a tribe, who speaks for the tribe? It really is the tribal government. And so we have to respect that. We know, for example, here in the United States, if we think about the federal government speaks for the United States. Not every citizen is going to agree with the message or the actions that that government is taking at any given time. Same thing with tribes. But really, who has that authority to speak for the tribe? It's the tribal government, especially as outsiders. That's really important in fostering tribal sovereignty. Another thing is that tribes can get together. And so you see groups of tribes. So I work a lot with the Intertribal Timber Council. That's a conglomeration of 100+ tribes that manage forests. They do lobbying for different laws at the federal level that would support tribal forest management and their own goals. They do scholarships for students. They do a whole range of things. And these tribes are coming together for that. That organization doesn't speak for the individual tribes, but collectively they get together and craft messages. It is not the tribal government, so they're not officially speaking for the tribe, but it is a unified tribal voice. And we see a lot of those organizations. Here in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council that's speaking for the tribes. Again, it is not a tribe, but it's speaking for the tribes. It's a way that the tribes can come together and have their voice heard. National Congress of American Indians is a large one at the federal level as well. So there's different places. Tribal colleges, for example. I like working with tribal colleges. They're not the tribal governments, even though they're chartered by the tribal governments, but it gives a unique insight into tribal community. Tribal elders, right? They have knowledge, etc. They different families. So I don't know. Hopefully that helps a little bit. And I think when we're institutions, particularly governmental institutions, we have to respect tribal sovereignty and understand that that's a government to government relationship that would be had with those tribes. I work a lot with the tribal natural resource departments and managers. So for me, that again, I'm not working with the government, but I'm working with a governmental entity. Thanks.
All right, we are almost at time. So I think there are so many great questions in the chat, and maybe we can share those questions with Mike and have him reach out individually afterwards too. So yes, I just want to thank you, Mike, for spending time with us this morning and sharing about your research and this model. I think folks are excited to see how they can implement it in the work that they do every day. I'm going to drop the link to the paper that Mike has published in the chat. We'll also send that out, as well as this recording and presentation slides later today. And like I said, this is our last of our speaker series for this year. We have recorded all of the sessions and they are listed on our YouTube channel. So we will have this uploaded later as well. And then you can view all 4 of our sessions there. So I would like to thank all of you for joining us this morning, and Mike will share your information out for folks to ask questions and follow-up questions later on. If you want to learn more about Reuse Minnesota, please go to our website, reusemn.org, to consider being a member or donating to the work we do. All right, so thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.